Opening scene. The camera zooms in on a packed auditorium. The crowd is buzzing with excitement as JD Vance stands confidently at the podium, his hands resting firmly on the sides. The atmosphere is electric. People are here to listen, to be inspired. The backdrop behind him is a large screen displaying an American flag waving softly in the wind. A hush falls over the audience as Vance clears his throat, ready to speak. "Folks, we are at a crossroads in our country," JD Vance begins, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "Everywhere we look, we see division. We see a government that often forgets the struggles of the hard-working American people. But I am here to tell you, there is hope. There is a way forward." Applause erupts from the audience, a wave of agreement, sweeping through the crowd. Vance nods in appreciation before continuing. "It is not about Republican or Democrat," he says. "It's about common sense. It's about leadership that serves the people, not itself. And it starts with holding those in power accountable." As he speaks, a man in the crowd shifts in his seat. A reporter, one known for his outspoken criticism of conservatives, leans forward, his pen tapping impatiently against his notepad. The audience listens intently, but the reporter's smirk suggests he's waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. "And let's talk about opportunity," Vance continues. "Too many Americans feel like the American dream is slipping away, but I believe—" Suddenly, the reporter stands up. His voice rings through the auditorium, cutting through the applause. "Mr. Vance," he shouts, "isn't it true that your policies are just designed to help the rich? That you're only here to push an agenda that benefits people like you?" A murmur spreads through the crowd. People glance at one another. Some boo, while others lean in, eager to hear the response. Vance looks at the reporter, unfazed. He exhales, slowly, gripping the edges of the podium, then offers a small, knowing smile. "Ah," he says, tilting his head. "The classic attack. Tell me, sir, how long have you been a journalist?" The reporter blinks, caught off guard. Over a decade." "A decade," Vance repeats. "And in that time, have you ever taken the time to sit with the people you claim to represent? The working class? The families struggling to put food on the table?" The reporter opens his mouth, then shuts it. Vance presses on. "Because I have. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, raised by my grandmother because my mother was struggling with addiction. I know what it's like to wonder if there's going to be food in the fridge. I know what it's like to see factories close, to watch good-paying jobs disappear while politicians in Washington write policies that serve their donors, not their constituents." A few members of the audience cheer. The reporter clears his throat. "But you're a millionaire now, aren't you? What do you know about struggle anymore?" Vance leans forward. His voice drops just slightly, carrying a quiet intensity. "You're right. I've done well," he says. "But do you know why? Because this country gave me the chance. I joined the Marines. I worked hard. I studied. I didn't rely on Washington to save me. I relied on grit, on determination. And now I fight to make sure others have that same opportunity. Not through government handouts that keep people trapped in poverty, but through policies that create jobs, strengthen families, and make communities safe again." The crowd roars in agreement. The reporter shifts on his feet, but Vance isn't finished. "But let's talk about you for a moment," he says. "You claim to be a journalist, here to seek the truth. So let me ask you, when was the last time you interviewed a single mother in Appalachia, a coal miner in West Virginia, a factory worker in the Rust Belt who lost his job because of reckless trade deals signed by the very people you defend?" The reporter hesitates. Vance doesn't blink. "You see, it's easy to stand in an air-conditioned newsroom writing stories about privilege and oppression while never stepping foot into the communities you claim to care about. But I have. And let me tell you something. Those people aren't looking for pity. They're looking for a fighting chance." Silence. Absolute silence. The kind that feels heavy. The kind that settles in the bones. The reporter swallows hard, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of Vance's words. The crowd is hanging onto every syllable. Then, a single person claps, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium is on its feet, a thunderous standing ovation, shaking the very walls. Vance lets the moment settle before continuing. This isn't about me. This isn't about some journalist trying to get a headline. This is about America. About the people who work tirelessly every day to build a better future for their children. And if standing up for them makes me a target, so be it. More cheers. The energy is electric. The reporter exhales sharply and finally sits down. He doesn't have a rebuttal. He doesn't have a follow-up question. Because what can he say? The truth stands on its own. Vance looks around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of everyday Americans who just want a leader who understands them. He gives a final nod before speaking once more. We move forward together. We build a stronger country together. And I promise you, I will never stop fighting for the American people. The audience erupts. The sound is deafening. But the journalist? He stays quiet, his pen still in his hand, but the smug look gone from his face. Because at that moment, he and everyone else in that room knows one thing. JD Vance had just won more than the debate. He had won the respect of the people. As the thunderous applause continued to shake the auditorium, JD Vance stood at the podium, letting the energy of the room settle. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to bask in the noise. He had said what needed to be said. The truth had landed exactly where it needed to, and he could see it in the faces of those in the crowd. Some were nodding, some had tears in their eyes, and others simply stared, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. The journalist, now seated, had his head slightly bowed. His pen was still gripped in his fingers, but it didn't move. He had come here expecting an easy confrontation, a chance to rattle a conservative figure with the usual accusations. But this was something else. He had underestimated JD Vance, underestimated the depth of his conviction, the raw authenticity of his words. Vance took a deep breath and continued, his voice a steady calm against the lingering echoes of applause. You see, he said, our country has been divided for too long, not by the people but by the powerful. They want us to believe that we're enemies, that a farmer in Ohio has nothing in common with a factory worker in Michigan, or a police officer in Texas has nothing in common with a teacher in Pennsylvania. But that's a lie. The real divide in this country isn't between left and right, it's between those who love this nation and want to build it up and those who profit off tearing it down. The crowd erupted again, but Vance raised a hand, signaling for them to let him finish. They respected him enough to listen. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. I don't care what cable news channel you watch. What I care about is this. Do you believe in the promise of America? Do you believe in an economy that rewards hard work, not connections? Do you believe in a government that works for the people, not the other way around? A resounding yes echoed from the audience. Vance nodded. Then we have more in common than they want us to think. He turned slightly, his gaze landing back on the reporter. Not in an aggressive way, just steady, measured. And that's why I don't fear your questions, he said plainly. Because when you stand on truth, you don't have to. When you fight for the people, not for headlines, not for corporate interests, not for political points, but for real, struggling, hardworking people, the truth will always win. The journalist finally lifted his eyes. For the first time, there was no smugness, no condescension, just silence. Vance took another step back from the podium, letting his words settle. Then, a moment of unexpected power, an elderly man near the front row, a veteran judging by the hat he wore, slowly rose to his feet. He clapped, not wildly, but firmly, steady, his hands meeting in deliberate, meaningful applause. Then another person stood, then another. And within moments, the entire room was on their feet again. But this wasn't just applause anymore. This was respect. The journalist shifted in his seat, his face unreadable. Maybe he was rethinking his approach. Maybe he wasn't. But it didn't matter, because JD Vance had done what he came to do. As the cheers swelled, Vance finally gave a small nod, stepping back from the microphone. He wasn't a man who needed to say more than was necessary. He had spoken his truth, and it had landed exactly where it needed to. And as the cameras panned over the room, over the faces of the people who had come here searching for something real, it was clear. JD Vance hadn't just given a speech. He had ignited something. And the silence left in the wake of his words? It wasn't defeat. It was... As JD Vance stepped away from the podium, the energy in the room remained electric. He didn't need to say another word. The crowd's reaction spoke for itself. Even those who had come in skeptical, unsure of what to expect, now watched him, with newfound respect. The journalist, still seated, seemed deep in thought. His fingers twitched slightly, as if debating whether to pick up his pen again, to scribble down a response, a rebuttal, something. But what could he write? That JD Vance had dodged his question? No, that wasn't true. That Vance had gotten defensive or angry? No, that wasn't true either. The truth was simple. JD Vance had answered with more honesty than anyone had expected. The veteran who had started the standing ovation took a step closer to the stage, eyes locked onto Vance. His weathered face held years of experience, and his stance was that of a man who had seen the best and worst of this country. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a lifetime. "Son," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I've heard a lot of politicians talk in my day, but that was something else." Vance met his gaze, nodding respectfully. "I appreciate that, sir." The veteran extended his hand, and without hesitation, Vance reached down, shaking it firmly. A moment of pure authenticity. Two men from different generations bound by a shared love for their country. The cameras caught it all. The image would be shared across social media, plastered on news articles, debated on talk shows. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that JD Vance had just done something rare in modern politics. He had spoken from the heart and let the truth do the work. As the applause finally began to settle, the journalist slowly stood. The crowd was still buzzing, some wiping away tears, others shaking their heads in awe at what they had just witnessed. The journalist opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Mr. Vance," he finally said, his tone different now. Less combative. More measured. "I may not agree with everything you stand for, but I have to admit, you speak with conviction. That's rare these days." Vance turned to face him, tilting his head slightly. "It shouldn't be," he replied. Simply. "The truth shouldn't be rare." The journalist swallowed hard, nodding slightly before taking his seat again. He had come here expecting a fight. Instead, he had gotten a lesson in leadership. The event coordinator stepped onto the stage, signaling that the night was winding down, but the crowd wasn't ready to leave just yet. There was still an energy in the air, a feeling that something significant had just happened. One by one, people began approaching the stage. Small business owners, teachers, factory workers, young students, each with something to say, something to share. Some just wanted to shake JD Vance's hand. Others wanted to tell him their stories. And he listened to every single one of them. The cameras kept rolling. The journalist, now seated at the back, watched it all unfold. He knew what the headlines would say tomorrow. But more importantly, he knew what he had just witnessed. This wasn't just politics. This was something bigger. JD Vance hadn't just silenced a critic. He had awakened a movement. The night stretched on as JD Vance remained on stage, shaking hands, listening to stories, and meeting the people who had gathered to hear him speak. This wasn't just a political rally anymore. It had become something deeply personal. People weren't just here to support a candidate. They were here because, for the first time in a long time, they felt heard. The journalist, still sitting at the back of the auditorium, watched in silence. He had covered countless speeches, debates, and town halls over the years. He had seen politicians deliver rehearsed lines, dodge questions, and pander to the crowd, but this was different. JD Vance wasn't just a man giving a speech, he was a man connecting with the very people he claimed to fight for. The journalist let out a slow breath, tapping his pen against his notepad. He knew his editors were expecting a certain type of article, a hit piece, something that painted Vance as just another right-wing populist, stirring up emotions with empty rhetoric. But how could he write that now? How could he ignore what he had just seen? He glanced down at his notes, filled with pre-written questions meant to trap Vance into a soundbite. But they felt useless now, irrelevant. The real story wasn't in the confrontation. It was in the response. Meanwhile, a middle-aged woman stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Vance noticed the way she hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak. "Ma'am," he said gently, turning toward her. "Did you want to say something?" She nodded, clearing her throat. "My son, he served in the military, Mr. Vance. He believed in this country just like you do." Her voice wavered. "We lost him last year, and I've been struggling to understand why everything feels so broken, why the country he gave his life for feels so divided." The crowd went silent again, a deep, heavy silence. Even the journalist felt a lump in his throat. JD Vance stepped forward, his expression filled with empathy. "I am so sorry for your loss," he said sincerely. "Your son was a hero, and we owe him more than we could ever repay." The woman nodded, blinking back tears. I want to believe that this country is still worth fighting for." Vance didn't hesitate. "It is," he said firmly, "and I will never stop fighting to prove it." A tear rolled down the woman's cheek. Without thinking, she reached out, and Vance embraced her, not as a politician, but as a fellow American who understood her pain. The crowd watched, some wiping their own eyes, others nodding solemnly. The journalist shifted in his seat. His editor had asked him to capture a moment. He had just found one, but it wasn't the one they had been hoping for. He stood up slowly, grabbing his bag. As he turned to leave, he glanced back one last time. JD Vance was still on stage, still listening, still shaking hands. For the first time in his career, the journalist wasn't sure how to write the story. Because this time, the truth wasn't something that could be twisted. It was undeniable. The journalist stepped outside into the cool night air, his mind still racing. He had come expecting to write a takedown piece, another article dismissing JD Vance as just another conservative firebrand stirring up the emotions of his base. But what he had witnessed was something far deeper, far more real. He pulled out his phone, staring at the blank notes app. His editor would be waiting. The headline had probably already been drafted. JD Vance dodges tough questions and heated. Exchange with reporter. But that wasn't the truth. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. The truth was that Vance had done something rare. He had taken a hostile question, turned it into a moment of reflection, and left the entire room in stunned silence. Not because he had outwitted the journalist, but because he had spoken with raw conviction. The door behind him swung open, and another attendee stepped out. A man in his late 40s wearing a faded work jacket and a baseball cap. He lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly before glancing at the journalist. "You with the press?" the man asked. The journalist hesitated before nodding. "Yeah." The man smirked. "Figured. You were the one trying to grill him earlier, right?" The journalist tensed slightly. "Just doing my job." The man nodded, taking another drag. "Sure, but I gotta ask, what did you think about all that?" He motioned toward the auditorium. The journalist exhaled sharply. He didn't have a prepackaged response. I don't know," he admitted. The man chuckled. "Fair enough, but I'll tell you what I think. I've been voting for years. Watched, Plenty of folks get up on stage and talk a big game. Most of them sound the same. But that guy? He gestured toward the building. That guy actually gives a damn. The journalist frowned. You think so? I know so, the man said firmly. I worked in manufacturing for 25 years, lost my job when the plant shut down. Nobody in Washington cared. Nobody in the media cared. Hell, I don't think anybody outside my town even noticed. He flicked his cigarette. But JD? He noticed. He actually talks about it. Not just in speeches, but for real. That's why people listen to him. The journalist didn't reply, because, deep down, he knew the man was right. The attendee sighed, crushing his cigarette beneath his boot. I don't expect you to write the truth, he said. I know how this works. Your editors already got the story they want to print. The journalist looked at him, something in his chest tightening. Yeah, maybe. The man clapped him on the shoulder. Do what you gotta do, but just remember, people ain't as dumb as the media thinks they are. We know when we're being lied to, and we know when someone's actually on our side. With that, he turned and walked off, leaving the journalist standing there, staring at his phone. A minute passed, then another. Finally, he opened his email, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The cursor blinked. His editor was waiting, but for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to write. Because this time, the truth wasn't what they wanted to hear. But it was the only thing.